Welcome viewers, Awakening Empire here with What If Deku Was in a Zombie Apocalypse is Chapter 1. It was foolish to think that Nezu hadn't prepared for everything, no matter how unlikely it might be, but somehow it was still a surprise how ready he was when things went wrong. Not the sort of ready that spoke of knowing something would happen, but the kind of ready that came with years of preparing for everything and anything at all. Of course, UA had a reinforced wall that could keep out any interlopers and locked down, so tight nothing and no one could get in. Of course, it was powered by its own clean energy grid and handled its own water and sanitation too. Of course, UA grew its own vegetables on campus, tended by the army of robots that also served as extra guards on campus. Of course, UA had a huge surplus of shelf-stable foods that could feed the whole city for years, longer when paired with Lunch Rush's food duplication quirk. Of course, there were storage rooms were filled with bedding and other supplies in the event that the mock cities needed to host real people one day. Of course, UA had a robust and easily enacted plan to create safe quarantines, even in the huge quantity needed for the huge number of refugees that flooded in at once. All Samantha-sensei had to do was follow a pre-laid blueprint. Of course, UA was equipped to handle the apocalypse. Even a zombie one. So here's how it happened. It started with a relatively innocuous scuffle at around 4 a.m. in Shizuoka City. The usual villain fight bulletin was sent out to the local area, but most people were tucked up safe in their beds at that hour anyway. It wasn't that unusual for a villain to have some kind of quirk that could incapacitate those nearby, so when the first responders, one hero and a police officer, collapsed, a standard barricade went up from the nearest police officers, and a notice went out for reinforcements and support. Given the awkward hour of the initial incident, just an hour before the early shift got up and the late shift ended, the sluggish response for backup wasn't unusual. The barricade was the priority, given that the first responders had managed to subdue the villain before being taken out themselves, in what looked to be a non-fatal manner. Had the villain still been conscious, or the injuries been potentially fatal, then perhaps things would have happened faster, for better or worse. As it was, the police at the barrier spent nearly 2 hours watching the still forms of those involved in the altercation, before additional support arrived in enough strength to risk opening the barrier to get to them. With dawn beginning to break over the horizon, the new wave of emergency responders breached the barricade to examine the downed hero, police and the villain. Given the early hour, there had been no bystanders, though by this time the early risers had started noticing the incident, and so that wouldn't be the case for much longer. It quickly became clear that despite there being no fatal wounds on any of the prone individuals, they were somehow all deceased. A cry went up immediately, but life-saving actions were far too late. The bodies were already in the early stages of rigor mortis, despite such a thing usually taking 4 hours instead of just 2. The unexpected fatalities had the barricade forming up once again, with the emergency services still inside, and the first full quarantine was enacted in a side street of Shizuoka City. By that time, the morning rush had begun in earnest and people went about their day around the incident site. The additional traffic slowed down the specialist emergency response teams by almost a full hour, but the trapped responders were at least able to use that time to take samples and begin the preliminary investigation into what had happened to those involved in the initial incident. It quickly became clear that the villain had been fatally wounded and also displayed symptoms of advanced decomposition to the body, given that they had been up and fighting just a few hours before. The only good news was that whatever had taken out the first responders and initiated the accelerated death processes wasn't contagious by itself. Over 3 hours after the barricade first went up, the specialist emergency response teams arrived, and those trapped were finally able to begin the process of being removed from the zone, along with the 3 bodies they were trapped with. It was during this transitionary stage that things went wrong, and those bodies started to get back up again. Or rather, they started lunging and biting people. Abruptly jerking back to life, 2 of the first emergency personnel on scene, the hero and a police officer, managed to bite several individuals. The hero had been secured to a gurney and was halfway to a nearby ambulance when they abruptly started snapping their teeth at anyone in reach. The restraints keeping them from falling from the gurney were the only reason they didn't manage to catch more than one person, but the unrestrained policeman had no such problem and bit at several people while on the ground before getting up and proceeding to throw themselves bodily at anyone in range, teeth gnashing furiously, completely out of control. The barricade firmed, but soon fell in the chaos as bystanders and emergency personnel fled from the attacking policemen and their fleeing victims. The morning rush was well underway by now as it was nearly 8 a.m., so the streets were flooded with commuters. There was a brief panic before someone with a destructive quirk lost control and killed the police officer, blowing them back into a shop front and bringing a wall down on them. Those who had been bitten were taken along to a secure hospital, along with the infected hero and the villain's body, while emergency services remained on site to investigate the evidence and extract the body of the police officer from the wreckage. 5 bite victims were recovered and packed into a transport, though there was some concern that other victims may have fled into the crowd. Complications arose when, 10 minutes into the drive, every bite victim began to lose consciousness. One woman who had just managed to catch the train at the last minute missed her stop, and the next, appearing to have fallen asleep in her seat. In 3 hours she would wake up and paint the train red with the blood of its passengers. The ambulance carrying the infected hero that had been restrained to their gurney crashed en route to the secure hospital. When emergency response arrived, the body of the hero was gone, having clearly torn free of its restraints and likely causing the crash. Minutes later, reports of a rabid villain began coming in from that area and nearby heroes and police scrambled to contain them. 2 hours after that, reports of an incident on a circular train that was soon pulling into Kikigawa Station began coming in. When the train arrived at the station, it looked like something out of a horror movie, blood and gore splattering the windows of the carriages. The survivors had all crammed into the front 2 sections, all 6 of them, including 4 unconscious individuals. It was from this incident that the most coherent data came, and this time those who had been bitten were carefully restrained and monitored on site. It was at this point that those keeping track of the incidents raised the alert level to statewide quarantine for travel. No incoming travelers were accepted into Shizuoka Prefecture, and outbound traffic would have to pass quarantine. Citizens were advised to stay in their homes, or if they were already outside, seek the nearest sanctioned shelter. An evacuation order for nearby unaffected areas outside the prefecture was put in effect, while areas with reports were placed under immediate quarantine. Outside of Shizuoka Prefecture, city borders were advised to close or enforce quarantine upon entry and prepare the same for the shelters. Shelters were dotted all over the cities of Japan, but they were typically for use in the event of villain attacks, not biohazards. While some of the larger ones were originally nuclear bomb shelters and had greater long-term lockdown ability, most were only intended for use for 24 hours at the most, and the available facilities reflected that. So even the people who made it to a shelter would only be buying themselves a short amount of time before they'd have to leave, or be rescued, or starve unless they were in the better-stocked shelters. With that in mind, many people hesitated on heading to the nearest shelter, as instructed once it became clear this wasn't going to be for just a few hours. As the PSA included alternative buildings for lockdown, however, the more industrious folk prepared to defend their own homes. Whole apartment complexes turned into fortresses almost overnight. While many people still fled, some to shelters or other safe places, some to try their luck at the docks or airports despite being told that Japan had been locked down entirely. Still, in a world that dealt with villain attacks regularly, the people were fairly used to coping with danger. The smart ones knew to get clear, or get down, and the dumb ones, the ones with cameras usually, died in droves and bought everyone else time to get themselves safe. Callous perhaps, but true. Despite the news spreading as to the severity of the situation, plenty of people still felt the need to head to the incident sites to see with their own eyes what was going on, if there really were zombies. Just because quarantines and such had been enacted, didn't mean that everyone followed them, and it only took a few fools to make things more difficult for everyone else. The rest of the country watched as reports coming out of Shizuoka showed rabid-looking civilians chasing fleeing folk and tearing the city apart. The initial evacuation alert had thousands of people flooding out of the city before it was completely locked down, but eventually all citizens were told to return to their homes or shelters. No one else was allowed to leave. By that time, which was about noon, what little information known about the quirk effects had been spread: the bite, the loss of consciousness, and advanced onset of rigor mortis that preceded the reanimation of the infected person. It was easy enough to ensure that no unconscious people were allowed into the safe cities or shelters, but bites, they could be hidden. With literally thousands of refugees, it was inevitable that someone was able to hide a bite and get to safety before succumbing. While there was some paranoia over people who were sleeping, lest they actually have fallen to the virus. In this case, it was a little girl, only 6. Her suddenly falling asleep was only to be expected after the stress of the evacuation, after all. 3 hours later, that little girl woke up in the main Iwata shelter and infected everyone inside. The lockdown bought enough time for nearby Tokyo to prepare for the onslaught, borders tightened for quarantine checkpoints and barriers erected. The rest of the country did the same, instigating drastic measures to try and protect their civilians and stop the spread of the infection. While hope remained that the outbreak would be contained to Shizuoka Prefecture, the rest of the country began preparing in case it didn't. Anyone outside of the major cities made their own efforts to prepare, to varying degrees, but everyone knew it was going to be tough and that many of the smaller towns weren't going to make it. Heck, even the larger ones weren't guaranteed to pull through. Nobody knew yet how long a zombie might live for, and thus how long they'd need to hold out for. Information was still scarce. It was like having a tsunami warning come through, but an indefinite one. For the first time in history, quirks were authorized to enact defensive measures. Anyone who could make some form of barrier were advised to start building walls. Anyone who had a quirk remotely suited to protecting a bunker or ensuring no infected entered were told to do so. Instructions were sent out to reinforce compounds and how to manage quarantine. Anyone who had a quirk or skill that could be utilized to ensure quarantine, they were authorized to use it. Town councils were given advice on how to coordinate with their townships in order to survive this attack. Of all things, the authorization of quirk use was what really brought it home to the people how severe this was. But that's what happened on a macro scale. Here's what happened on a micro one. UA was probably the safest place in Musitafu right now. Too bad Izuku wasn't anywhere near it. He'd been at a specialist clinic in Shizuoka that morning to get his hands looked at. Recovery Girl was a suitable nurse and a seasoned pro hero, but she wasn't a specialist in long-term nerve damage a la pulverized hands. His appointment had been early in the morning with the idea that he'd take the train to UA once he was done, and so he was excused for the morning lessons. His mom had offered to go with him, since it was outside Musitafu if just barely, but Izuku assured her he'd be fine on his own. Now here he was, out in the street in the middle of some kind of lockdown. He wasn't sure what was going on, only that his session had been interrupted and he'd been told to leave and get to somewhere safe. The clinic wasn't too far from home, only a few stops on the train, but that was far enough that he didn't know his way around. He wasn't familiar with this area and wasn't sure where the shelter was. People were running in different directions and he wasn't sure who to follow when he heard a shout. "Kid! In here!" The call came from behind him, and Izuku reflexively ran towards it, the straps of his backpack held tightly in his grip. A man stood in the doorway to a small hardware store, gesturing him to come over. The shutters were half down, clearly in the process of being lowered. "Come on, this emergency is serious business. Get inside, we're locking it down." "Shouldn't we get to a shelter?" "Nah, the shelter's 10 minutes away from here, and there's reports that this madness is gonna hit us before we'd make it. No, safer to stay here for now." Whatever was going on sounded serious, and his phone was blowing up with news reports and warnings that he'd missed while he had it turned off for his appointment, too many to sift through, while out in the middle of the street. He hustled into the shop with the stranger, a little nervous but taking the opportunity to scroll through his phone while the owner locked up. Should have figured something was wrong. There's been some kind of kerfuffle down round Ishikawa's shop since early this morning, I heard. Normally a fill-in attack gets cleaned up pretty sharpish, but they had the barricade up this morning, so I heard. Ishikawa. Yay, my nearest competitor. He's a few blocks away. We're pretty friendly, give each other calls now and then when something local's going on that might affect our business. He called me saying I'd be getting his customers this morning 'cause of the barricade nearby. He was complaining that they weren't bringing it down, even though it had been in place for hours. Haven't heard from him since then though, and the news talked about another emergency down that way a while after that. I just been working in the back, so I'm not sure what's going on, just heard the emergency alert. As he spoke, the guy secured the shutters closed and led them inside the shop proper, so he could lock the front door too, shortly followed by the service entrance in the back. There. That should hold us for now. So what's your name, kid? I'm Kanata, I own this place. Midoriya. He stuttered a little. Come on, let's get comfortable for a bit. My apartment is upstairs in the back. It has a TV we can watch the news on. You're just letting me into your home. I could be some kind of troublemaker. You're wearing a UA uniform, kid. They don't let just anyone into that school. Nah, that's proof enough that you're a good sort, as far as I'm concerned. Well, fair enough. The two of them traipsed up the stairs into a small, but tidy apartment. As promised, there was a TV which was quickly flicked on. A lady broadcaster appeared on screen. Is an emergency broadcast. All citizens of Shizuoka, please get to safety. Here's what we know at this time. A clip played on the screen, a little map in the corner, identifying it as coming from a shopping mall not too far from here, judging by what he recognized. People were running away in a panic while others chased them and pounced. The clip cut away just before one victim's arm was being pulled off. Holy shit. The guy Kanata muttered. It appears to be some kind of pathogen, transmissible by biting from an infected person. Current data seems to show that once bitten, an individual will soon after fall unconscious and die, showing signs of advanced death symptoms before reanimating several hours later and attacking. At this time we do not know what this is, but what it is doing is clear. If you are not in a shelter, get to one as soon as you can, or lock yourselves inside if you can't. I'm going to give you a list of areas currently under direct attack, along with a list of shelters outside of those areas that you can safely enter. Quarantine procedures are in effect, however, so there are queues outside some of these shelters. With that in mind, we're listing a few safe alternatives that should be able to hold up. The broadcaster proceeded to do as promised, listing the unsafe zones first. When the district they were in was listed, Kanata swore but didn't seem surprised. We'll just have to hunker down here for now. This doesn't look like it's going to blow over quickly and we're too far away to get anywhere safer. Best to wait for more information. Are you sure we'll be safe enough here? Yeah, kid. There's no windows downstairs, besides the ones at the front, and I upgraded security last year after a villain attack. We'll be safe. You can check the entry points if you're worried though. I'm gonna pack a bag in case. We need to get out of here later though. They spent the next few hours in front of the TV listening to news as each new piece of information came out. Most of it wasn't good, though it wasn't a surprise that the zombies didn't just stop. Once they bit someone, it was still awful to hear that they were actively eating the victims, who couldn't get away. Kanata made them both tea in a surprisingly dainty tea set for such a rugged guy, but just muttered was my wife's when he saw Izuku looking surprised. Sitting in front of that TV was probably the worst moment in his life since he was 4 years old. The reporter emphasized staying indoors, stating that most heroes were policing the shelters right now so that everyone could get safe before attempting to stop the zombie threat. It was heartbreaking to hear but pragmatic. If people were safe, the zombies would not be able to spread its virus and the heroes wouldn't have even more enemies to deal with. Izuku could barely stand it though. His heart cried out to go and help people, but despite keeping his ears open, he didn't hear anyone nearby shouting for help, and leaving Kanata's was just asking to become a victim himself. Besides, what could he even do? He only just got a handle on full cowl, and he couldn't afford for his control to slip and hurt himself. Even if he did take the risk and try and help people, there was a good chance he'd get bitten if he tried to fight a zombie, since he didn't have long-ranged attacks that didn't damage himself. No, until he had better control of full cowl, it would be irresponsible to go out there. If there was one lesson that the teachers had been trying to beat into their heads, with limited success, it was when the right decision was not to insert yourself into a situation. The heroes wanted to get those they could save before focusing on the zombies, and he'd be working against that goal if he left the safety of Kanata's shop, at least for now. There seems to be a window where those who've been bitten fall unconscious and die before reanimating, that is estimated to be around 2 to 3 hours or so. We don't have an exact time for you all, and there's a chance that those with mutation quirks might have a different transformation rate. We don't know at this time. Even so, be aware that if there are corpses on the ground, well, they might not stay that way in a few hours. Government advice at this time, though grim, is to secure a bitten soul while they're prone, so that they don't rise later and threaten you. The broadcaster tried to keep a grimace off her face as she said it, but the words weren't any less horrifying. The estimated number of confirmed and active zombies at this point is in the dozens, and the deaths are even higher. The first incident infected 2. We know that those 2 infected at least 6 more, but possibly more than that. At least one of those who got bitten fled before the paramedics could take them into care. This person got on a train and killed most everyone on it when they reanimated several hours later. Of those who survived, many had been bitten. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, everyone, but it is extremely important that we isolate ourselves so that this infection doesn't spread any further. If it does, it's going to be so much worse for us all. Somehow it was hearing that jolted Izuku into action. I need a map. A map. What for? I took the train to get here, but they're not running anymore. I'm going to need to find my own way back. Kanata looked at him like he was stupid. Kid, you just heard the lady. We gotta stay holed up safe, so we don't make things worse. I know, and I'm sorry, but I've got to get home. My mom is going to be so worried. Kid, it's too dangerous out there, minus. I'm sorry, but I have to go. Kanata stared at him for a long moment, but went and got a map regardless, laying it out for him. I still think you're making a mistake, kid, but I'm not about to keep someone where they don't want to be. If it all goes tits up, you can come on back here though, as long as you ain't bit. Thank you. Kanata heaved a discontented shrug. If you're sure, kid, I can't make you stick with me. I expect she'd have gone to a shelter though, or perhaps your school if she thought you'd be there. Just be safe, Kay. And hey, if you make it to UA or whatever, send someone around to old Kanata's hardware shop. I'll still be here. He pointed a thumb at himself with a reassuring smile, and received a tremulous one in return. I will. He nodded his head firmly, gripping his backpack in tight fists. I'm sorry, if I don't go now I might not have the chance later. It's going to get worse the longer it goes on until it gets better. He might not make it now, but neither of them said it out loud. I hear ya, I hear ya. I hope you make it, kid. Be careful. Thanks, Kanata-san. See you round. The pair were silent as Kanata watched Izuku leave. Rather than risk opening the shutters, he instead carefully dropped out of the window on the second floor, landing lightly on the bins out the back. He gave a little wave and took a quick look around before departing. The streets were pretty empty by now as everyone had already fled to shelters. Izuku kept to the middle of the street, so he had a clear view of his surroundings. It was eerily quiet, at least for the first few minutes. He thought he saw a few rustling curtains, like there were people hiding in their apartments, who didn't want him to see them, but he wasn't about to stop and look closer. He kept his eyes sweeping the streets and his ears pricked. He'd seen on the TV that the zombies could be pretty fast, and he didn't want to be caught off guard. It took about 10 minutes for him to encounter his first zombie. It was just one, stood between two cars parked by the curb. It twitched intermittently and he could hear it clacking its teeth together from halfway down the street. Izuku froze and ducked low, panic flooding his body. The last thing he wanted was to get chased. They looked relentless on TV, and even as a hero in training, his stamina wasn't endless. Not to mention, if he started running, he might run into more of them and then he'd really be screwed. He was still far from his apartment, so he needed some kind of plan. Izuku carefully backed around the corner. For now he could take the next turn off instead and avoid that zombie. It wouldn't be hard to get back to his planned route. Still, he'd need some kind of plan in case he got spotted. He had full cowl, but without recovery girl on hand, it was risky to use it. If he misjudged it at all and broke his bones, he'd be a sitting duck, waiting for the zombies to get him. He'd not had a chance to use it since they'd taken down Stain, and while he was mostly confident he'd be okay, without the safety net of having Recovery Girl, or even Gran Torino around to get help in case something went wrong, he was loath to use it unless he had to. With that in mind, Izuku snuck his way down the quiet streets. He had to make 2 more detours around zombies before he made it across the border from Shizuoka and into Musetafu. He was 2 blocks from home when things went really wrong. He'd been creeping past a zombie that was hunched over someone, making awful fleshy noises that he really didn't want to hear or look at. Izuku tried to slink past as silently and quickly as he could, resisting the urge to cover his ears and block out the awful noise. In his haste, though, he kicked a little rock. That was all, just a tiny rock. It clinked a few steps and the zombie's head shot in his direction, and Izuku ran. It was probably stupid of him, because he made a lot more noise when he ran and the zombie began chasing after him, but the instinctive terror that flooded through him didn't allow any other action. He didn't even think of using full cowl, which was probably for the best. He was so mindless with fear, he most definitely would have broken his bones. Izuku ran the remaining 2 blocks to his house, dodging around the few zombies between him and his goal and gaining a small group of them chasing behind him. He was sobbing with fear as he ran towards the double doors that secured the whole apartment and fumbled for his keys, dropping them twice before giving up and running again, the zombies almost upon him. He ran around the side of the apartment and climbed on top of a car before using full cowl to jump up to the balcony outside his flat. He crashed against the railing and threw himself over it to land on his back, but the car alarm blared behind him, luring more undead to the area. Breath hitching, he clambered to his feet and fumbled for the little balcony key desperately. Eventually the key turned and he stepped inside. The apartment was empty, and Izuku swallowed the sob that wanted to burst out. He moved through the apartment and dropped his backpack in the Jenkin before doubling back to close the glass balcony door. He'd just have to wait for his mum to come back, he thought to himself. That was all. He'd just wait a while and she'd come back. Izuku spent the rest of the day with the TV on as more and more bad news came out of it. Hearing that the Iwata shelter had been infected and abandoned had him fearing for his mother even worse, wherever she was. The zombies outside the apartment building multiplied, as those caught by the ones he'd passed reanimated, and lumbered towards the group, occasionally bumping into Ecother and other objects and subsequently setting off the car alarm that lured more, the cycle repeating every now and then. He jolted every time the alarm went off, hiding away in his apartment. He ate plain rice for dinner, and went to bed that night on his own, still wearing his UA uniform. 24 hours after Shizuoka was locked down, the first reports of rabid people started coming in at Tokyo.